I'm your host, Victoria Cuquette. For those of you who haven't participated in past sessions, or those of you who have participated in past sessions, welcome back. And for anyone newly joining us, thanks for being here and welcome. John Beebe, Ashley, Denny, Patch, and I have programmed a new and exciting season for all of you that I think you'll find timely, responsive, and engages those who are advancing democracy at all levels across Canada. And if you yourself have an interesting idea or topic in mind, I invite you to write to us and share. So it's been a minute since we've seen one another, but we're excited to be with all of you. I hope you're all doing well and that you're safe and that we can cultivate an engaging and in-depth conversation, one that I hope you'll all actively take part in. But first, I'd love to have all of you introduce yourselves to me and to one another. So please use the chat function to share your names and what organizations you're joining from today. So today we're going to discuss a really important and exciting project called the Canadian Commission for Democratic Expression. Imagine for a moment a lottery where citizens across the country are invited to come together, deliberate a central question around democracy, work with national experts, and make recommendations. And these are people like you and me, which is very cool. There are two groups working on this, which include a Citizens Assembly of Canadians who've responded to that invite issued by lottery, and a commission of experts who've been invited to submit their subject matter expertise and work in parallel with the Assembly. The work is being advanced by two extraordinary organizations, Mass LBP and my own alma mater, Public Policy Forum. So I'd like to thank Mass and PPF for partnering with us on this event and bringing the work to all of us and the communities you're here representing. So we're going to have a discussion on citizen-centered democracy. We're going to share learnings from Demacts, as we affectionately call it, and specifically the work done by the 2021 Citizens Assembly. We have representation from across the project, from the organizations and leaders who dreamed it up and designed it, as well as some of the engaged citizens who rolled up their sleeves and actively worked on the challenge of democracy itself. So let's explore the purpose, the aims, the process of the project, and what lessons you can bring back to your own communities. So now I know I've just kind of overviewed it, but we want to do a quick poll question with all of you. So based on what I said, if you had an opportunity to serve on a citizens assembly, then would you? So we have the options for answers there, and we would love to just see you answer the poll. I mean, absolutely is taking the cake. Maybe, possibly, some people need to hear more. Okay, so we're just going to share the results with you and keep going. So I'm excited to hear there's an appetite for this kind of work, and you'll hear more in a moment. But first, I'd just like to offer a quick land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually, so you may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we're on today to reflect on the importance and significance of those lands. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to collaborating in the spirit of reconciliation. To personalize things, I myself am a first-generation Canadian. My parents come from Australia, which is another white settler colony, and the former colonized India and Trinidad and Tobago. So my own commitment to a more equitable future is deeply felt, and in solidarity with respect to my own maternal ancestors having been indentured laborers. To continue and remain active in my learning, I recently signed up for OCAP training with the First Nations Governance Center to learn more about First Nations data sovereignty in an effort to remain active. So if that is interesting to anyone else, Ashley will share the link in the chat and you can check out that learning as well. So now to the program. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce and welcome our guests. First, Peter McLeod, Principal and Founder at Mass LBP, as well as Chair for the Citizens Assembly on Democratic Expression. Peter will provide an overview of Demacts for us and set the scene. Who has worked? Sorry about that, everyone. So following Peter, we'll invite Lisa Semchuk to the stage, who has worked on Demacts since its inception and is on the Commission Secretariat on behalf of Public Policy Forum. And then we'll invite in the citizens, some of the citizens themselves, Dawn Sugimoto and Olivia Iman-Godin, who are representatives of the Assembly. So a warm welcome to all of you. And Peter, I'd like to hand things over to you first, so you can set the stage and give us an overview of some of the work, and then we'll layer in the experiences of others.
Tremendous. Well, thank you very much, Victoria, and hi, everyone. It really is a treat. I'm a big fan of everything that Ryerson's been doing through Democracy Exchange, and to be able to kind of meet with you this afternoon as part of our launch this week of the 2021 Citizens Assembly report is particularly special. I was just, of course, scanning through some of the people who are on the line this afternoon, and we have, of course, members of this year's Assembly, and so I'm grateful that you've joined us. I also see a couple members of the 2020 Assembly, which is terrific. I also see wonderful people who've been a huge influence in our work on Citizens Assemblies in Canada, like Judith Maxwell, who I always like to point to for her path-breaking work with the Canadian Policy Research Network. So there's a lot of credit to spread around in the discussion. And I also know that there are a number of people on the call this afternoon who are interested not only in the topic of this year, but of course in the use of citizens' assemblies more generally. So I'm going to try in the sort of 10 minutes I've got to cover off quite a bit of ground. This begins, of course, with acknowledging my colleagues at the Public Policy Forum. They're the ones who really had the inspiration to launch a 3-year discussion on something that I think most Canadians would acknowledge as of pivotal importance right now. How do we regulate social media, what has become our digital public sphere in Canada, in a way that's advantageous? And by advantageous, I mean in a way that is pro-social, that helps us build the quality and kind of society that many of us would acknowledge as so important, and yet often we fail to see when we log in day to day and use the internet to connect with peers, as well as receive so much news and information. Let me just say a little bit about citizens' assemblies broadly. Citizens' assemblies go by many different names. Sometimes they're called citizen juries, reference panels, but the core idea here is that you bring together a randomly selected cohort of small c citizens. I mean representatives. Formal citizenship is not a criteria here, but we're asking people to play the role of a public representative. And more than filling out a survey or attending a town hall meeting, we're asking people to really get under the hood of some complex issues. And by speaking with one another and interacting with various experts in a citizen expert dialogue, to kind of come to common ground on what they believe ought to be the best path forward for government and public policy. And so rather than focusing on private interests, citizens' assemblies try to exercise what Daniel Yankelevich famously described not as public opinion, but as public judgment. Citizens' assemblies fundamentally are problem-solving mechanisms, and so framing public issues as problems to be addressed is part of what makes them unique. If you're interested in how citizens' assemblies might fit into the typical way of making public policy in this country, this is probably the easiest diagram I've been able to find. Often problems are identified within government, options are developed, and almost sadly, like a tick box exercise on the way out the door, we go to public consultation and we make sure we've got it broadly right. I think there's so much value to be found in bringing citizens upstream in any policy discussion so that they can articulate the values and the priorities. Everybody understands that problem identification, framing the question, really is what defines the range of potential solutions. So let's move citizens upstream in the policy dialogue, because that's where they'll probably have the greatest leverage and impact. And yes, absolutely, this is not about replacing all forms of consultation with deliberative processes or assemblies. Let's bring as many people back into the conversation to make sure that there's good alignment between our policy options, our proposals, and the actions that are ultimately taken. If you wanted like a really simple way of thinking about what assemblies are trying to do, it's about displacing a kind of prevailing mindset that regards the public as a bit of a risk to be managed, and recognizing them as a resource, not only to be tapped, but to be nourished, to be invested in. And that's what I think assemblies do well. There are 3 parts of any assembly: the mandate, the big ask, and a clear task. We're asking people for 40 or more hours of their time. And at a moment where it seems like People are rightfully preoccupied with their day-to-day concerns, and it's impossible to get them to fill out that survey or town hall meeting. Again and again over the course of the past 14 years at Mass, we've seen thousands and thousands of Canadians from every walk of life raise their hands and say, no, I want to be involved because I want a chance to give back. I care about this issue. And more than anything, I think this is going to allow me to make a difference. So then we need a good way of bringing people together. And that's what the Civic Lottery is about. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then there's the deliberation. And, sometimes assemblies are kind of crudely described. Oh, it's just like putting the people in charge. Nah, it's a citizen expert dialogue. And I'll illustrate that as I get into the program. I'm happy to report to you that since those early assemblies in British Columbia in 2004 and in Ontario in 2006 that addressed the question of our voting systems, there have been more than 40 citizens assemblies that have taken place in all regions of the country. And it's now part of a bigger global story where more than 400 assemblies have taken place across the OECD. In fact, we now have a dedicated research group at the OECD. And if you're not familiar with their work on democratic innovation and what they've termed the deliberative wave, I recommend it to you. So let me talk a little bit about, yes, what we affectionately call Demacts, the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression, of which the Citizens Assembly is one part. It's a unique hybrid model. We have a 7 or 8 member commission this year, co-chaired by the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin, Professor Taylor Owen, and made up of people whom you might expect with real expertise and depth in the question at hand, which is about regulating social media. And then we have our assembly, which is made up of 42 citizens from across the country, which have their own kind of expertise. After all, they are using these technologies, their families, their neighbors, their employment, all intimately involved in the ways in which social media affect how we communicate and affect how we interact with others. So we have two bodies. The Commission reports to the federal government through Canadian Heritage and the Minister. The Assembly reports both to Canadian Heritage directly, as well as to the Commission. And this year we sequenced it so that the Commission was looking at a slightly wider set of concerns focused on accountability and transparency, while the Assembly could take a deep dive in looking at whether there ought to be legal penalties or other consequences where individuals or organizations knowingly spread disinformation online with the intent to cause harm. This is as you're about to hear from my colleagues on the Assembly, Don and Olivier, this is a very thorny set of questions. And over the course of 40 hours, this was pre-Omicron, and so we were able, fortunately, with our fair share of rapid tests, to actually convene in person, not something we could do in our first year. We began our deliberations online. They continued in Ottawa in November. And over the course of those 40 hours, people had the opportunity to learn about some of the core democratic principles at stake, think about how existing institutions and regulations work, consider the effectiveness of Canadian law, and quite critically, because this is such a fast-moving set of concerns, look to how other countries are responding to the challenge. So how did Don and Olivier and others wind up in the room? We sometimes like to joke that a civic lottery is like Willy Wonka's magic policy ticket. You walk in one day, a brown envelope's fallen through the door. Yes, it's a brown envelope. It looks a little more like the CRA. Canadians are more inclined to open it. Well, we sent more than 12,000 of these randomly, working with Canada Post. And at a time when everybody's hunkered down and rightfully concerned about the pandemic, more than 600 volunteers replied. This is consistent with the response rate that we have had over the hundreds of thousands of letters we've now sent to Canadians. In fact, about 1 in 38 households in Canada have now received one of these invitations to volunteer, typically a 5 to 7% response rate. That's something that, of course, stands up very well against any form of direct mail or marketing. So when we randomly selected the members, of course, we're using a stratification method in order to ensure that we have distribution roughly proportionate to population across the country and regions. Of course, segmenting for age, conscious of the proportion of the population with primarily Francophones and Anglophones, and of course ensuring that we have good representation from First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit. One of the things that strikes people, especially living in Canada's largest cities, is to think about the diversity of the panel as a whole. This is just to remember that outside of our major centers, the non-white population of Canada remains somewhere on the order of about 22 to 25%, and 30% of the members of the Assembly self-identified as being part of a racialized group. So we like to call this Canada in a room, and it's so much the better when we're actually able to, with enough public health precautions, get people in the room as we did in Ottawa. I mentioned a moment ago a citizen expert dialogue. The Commission, over the course of its proceedings, of course, gets to hear from some of the top people in the world, and equally so for the members of the Assembly. I'd note just a few of them to you. Jane Litvinenko from Harvard University, from Global Affairs, Galit Dobner, Richard Fadden, Canada's former Deputy Minister of Defense and National Security Advisor, and the distinguished professor Michael Geist, who I think is also joining us this afternoon, gave a rousing evening keynote presentation clarifying a number of the issues for the Assembly. We appreciate it, and it would be impossible to run a good Assembly without the kind of curriculum that we're able to create based on the contributions of our external experts. A lot of planning goes into mounting an Assembly. I mentioned the 3 virtual sessions. Then we continued with our Ottawa proceedings. Conceptually, it's important to appreciate that about fully 50% of that program is spent interacting with these experts, the balance in deliberation. We move from a discussion of values ultimately to discussing issues, to identifying priorities, and cashing out a series of recommendations. Many of you may have downloaded already the report. You'll see that the recommendations are written in the members' own words. And here we are at the National Arts Centre, an appropriately Canadian bit of swag, a democratic expression toque, which kept our brains warm as we were doing all of this good work through our 4.5 days together. Nothing surprising about the proceedings. Look, we're not in some mahogany paneled chamber. We're working at roundtables. We're mixing up, moving around frequently. And it's really through an iterative discussion that the Assembly members could zero in on their recommendations. And I want to just spend the last maybe 3 or 4 minutes talking about the results. Ultimately, the Assembly named 7 values which they believe should guide Canadian public policy in this area. They wouldn't be surprising to you, recognizing that any regulatory regime needs to be flexible and adaptive. This is why they focused on it being dynamic, that it needs to continue to promote expression and not choke off expression that is wanting to be expressed by Canadians. But so much more needs to be done to protect users and allow users to do more to control their online experience. And I particularly love this value because I think it's emphatically Canadian, because at the end of the day, we're practical people. It's got to be doable. It's got to be stuff we can implement. And there are a couple of facets to that. Look, I mean, Canada remains a kind of a middle power, and most of these big tech companies are not based in Canada. And there are limits to what Canada's regulatory apparatus will be able to achieve. And so the members of the Assembly pointed to the importance of working with multilateral bodies in other countries and focusing on what we can profitably do here at home. The Assembly named 7 different perceived threats. These are not in order of priority. Everything from the radicalization of our population and the use of information as a weapon, to broader concerns about mental health and well-being. I think a real sensitivity to the fact that Canada remains a significant global multiculture, and consequently the risk of polarization and social division is significant and really can't be allowed to fester. I think the members of the Assembly were very sensitive to the fact that often racialized groups and other minorities can find themselves the victim and be disproportionately discriminated by activities happening online, and that strenuous efforts need to be made in a number of quarters that I'm going to illustrate to ensure that those harms are not as prevalent as they may be right now. And so 27 recommendations are the result of their work, focused in 7 areas. First of all, taking up this question of criminal penalties. We could have an entire seminar just on that, and of course the legal history of the criminalization of speech in Canada. I think the fastest way to address it is to say that the Assembly wanted to focus on those instances where it could point to a clear conspiracy, multiple actors in a coordinated way, targeting individuals, and that the harm would have to be caused within Canada in order to be profitably prosecuted. But in the majority of instances, we're going to have to strengthen the hand of users themselves in order to better control their experience online. And this goes well beyond, I think, what has been contemplated. Users owning their data, much stronger privacy provisions, a standardized set of controls that would apply regardless of the site or platform that you're part of. The ability to move your data from one platform to another, also addressing the Assembly's concern about digital monopolies. One thing that I believe every Assembly member came away from recognizing was that there's still a lot we don't know in this area, and it is a fast-moving policy field, and we need more dedicated research. Consequently, they called for the development of new centers focused on this, and the tri-councils augmenting their funding to researchers in this area. Believing that transparency and accountability, much like the Commission, is critical. They call for a number of new standards related to the use of the algorithms, the extent to which they may amplify messages that then increase the prevalence of online harm and disinformation. And while it's always easy to maybe dismiss calls for more public education, I think the Assembly was very sensitive to the fact that the kind of pace of change in Canadian society and the extent to which we've all found ourselves with these tools without anywhere near the kind of the orientation that maybe would be beneficial. And so they stressed in their report the kinds of public education initiatives they would like to see. They also endorsed the first year's Assembly's recommendation of there being an independent digital regulator in this space. And we've been very heartened by the conversations we've had so far with government as they prepare to bring forward a renewed legislative package. We're hopeful that we'll see aspects of the first year's report and our most recent work taken up in legislation as well. So I want to sort of bring this to a conclusion, but urging all of the people on the line today to visit the website, read the recommendations in your own words. There's a good description of the process. There's a short video from our first year. And I hope all of this is interesting to you, and that we can look forward to what will still be our third year, because in about 60 days' time, we shift gears. We start focusing on what will be the topic for our third year that is currently being determined. More letters are going to go out to Canadians. A new group of 42 will be selected and impaneled, and they'll have an opportunity, hopefully in person all the way through, to come together and to continue this important work. Just in conclusion, one of the things that has been demonstrated to me through these processes is that while people want a say, and they will sound off on social media, and they may fill out your survey, they are also willing to serve. And I think, the future of good, responsible government is a future that creates more seats at the table for more Canadians to serve in exactly this fashion. We've discovered again and again that the problem isn't that we ask too much of people. People will make the time. we've been asking far too little. Victoria.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. I think you really provided an overview of, how it was built, how it works, to what ends, all the pieces of the deliberations. And that's precisely what, we wanted to do here today, was really give our guests an understanding of this process and the thought that went into it, so that perhaps, they can go on Mass's website and, look at how to run a civic lottery themselves, and really start to instrumentalize and use this process. So I also want to say that to all of our guests, so that, we pose these questions to Peter and the rest of our panel when we get to the question period, so that, this can really be an option for you. And who knows, maybe you will get one of those envelopes in your own mailbox coming soon. So Peter, I have just a couple follow-up questions for you, and then would love to invite Lisa to join us. But, listening to some of this, these are highly complex and technical issues, ones that, I've had to kind of Google some of the terms and some of the ideas, and really even some of the policy going into it. So when designing and ideating the Citizens Assembly, what was on your mind that citizens could really offer to this process to strengthen it?
Well, I think I'd respond to this in two ways. One of the things, I said kind of first off that citizens' assemblies are fundamentally problem-solving mechanisms. So there needs to be real clarity of task. And we spent a lot of time working with our colleagues at the Public Policy Forum, zeroing in on a topic that we thought could be profitably addressed, given the time that we had as well. So, I mean, anyone familiar with any kind of group work knows that clarity of task is pretty key, and it is almost a mantra for us at Mass that we say, without clarity, everything crumbles. So we've got to be really sure that what we're asking people to do is clear and understood and doable. I think more broadly though, this is a topic that Canadians really care about. And up until this point, while there have been no shortage of op-eds about this, and I'm sure no shortage of really hard conversations around kitchen tables across this country, there hasn't been a way to bring Canadian voices into a policy debate that has principally been conducted between representatives of big tech and academe and some of the nonprofit organizations that are setting out important concerns that need to be addressed. So we really, I think the utility of this was cutting Canadians into the conversation, and it's incumbent that happen, because of course the social impact of these communications technologies is just so profound. And my frustration is always that, well, this was, I think a good experience for the 42 who were a part of it. There are millions more that we would like to see engaged as well.
And yeah, so thank you for that. I know that you've used this Citizens Assembly and kind of civic lottery model in other places as well. And that, this is something that occurs internationally on high profile and sometimes controversial issues such as abortion in Ireland. So I'm just wondering, to have some of your thoughts on how has the effect or the process been similar or different in these efforts, and perhaps like one other topic you may have used this for in Canada.
Well, I think sadly this may be an all too typical story of sort of Canadian innovations. We had that breakthrough moment in BC in 2004, where because of the utter failure of their electoral system, it was such a grossly disproportionate result that the government of the day felt that they needed to do something. And what they did was the Citizens Assembly. And in that era of democratic renewal of the late 90s and early 2000s, Ontario copied that, and of course it was a different kind of experience and in a different province with a different political culture. But I think it should be heartening to many people on the call that in the sort of quixotic way by which innovations are sometimes introduced, it was David Farrell from Ireland, an expert on electoral systems, who attended the Ontario Assembly and became so inspired by what he saw that he went back to Ireland and said, we have some intractable issues that maybe this process could help us address. And namely, that was the question of reproductive choice in Ireland, as well as the question of same-sex marriage or marriage equality in Ireland. And, it's had such a galvanizing effect throughout Europe that if you can profitably use a process like a Citizens Assembly to address those two topics in Ireland, then maybe there's some merit to using these processes to deal with the really tough stuff in other jurisdictions as well. And that's what's been so heartening to work with colleagues in France and Scotland, in Denmark, in Germany, to help them learn from our experience and us now able to learn from their experience as they're dealing with everything from car-free jurisdictions in Copenhagen. Look, the mayor of Paris, who's really been a transformative force in that city, has just established a permanent Citizens Assembly to advise City Hall. And in Belgium, we see a permanent parliamentary chamber made up of randomly selected citizens. And how about this? Randomly selected citizens now sit on parliamentary committees next to MPs in Belgium. And I think this is just expanding our sense of political imagination. So there's a lot to be excited for right now.
Absolutely. And, we can really feel that excitement as you talk about it, and really knowing that this is kind of a global tool that's been taken up at different levels and to different ends is quite inspiring. So I think we know the merits and we're all excited about it, which is why we're here. But I'm just wondering, because there are some critics of this process who may critique, I think perhaps undeservedly, but suggest that this is, an elaborate and expensive form of consultation. What would you say to the critics? And, what really happens if the powers that be that these recommendations are submitted to don't necessarily agree with them?
Well, I mean, there are a number of grounds on which you could critique these processes. And again, it would be the subject of a longer discussion. And I think that criticism is welcome. I mean, look, we're going through a period of innovation. It's now entering a period of standardization. It's my hope that it will go through the experience of real institutionalization. And inevitably, it's going to disappoint and come up short. I think we have to be careful that while we want to hold these processes to a higher standard than the status quo, that it can't be an impossible standard. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the concerns I have had is that these processes need to tie back to government rather than being funded by nonprofit groups or advocacy organizations. That I think it's a more compelling call to citizens when the letter lands that it is an opportunity for public service rather than community service. I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but when I look at the ways in which these processes are institutionalizing and succeeding in Europe, usually it's because they're being commissioned directly from government rather than advocacy organizations that are looking to advance a cause. And I think that makes sense just intuitively to most people. Ultimately, the success of these processes will rise or fall based on their ability to demonstrate independence and legitimacy, and ultimately, it always has to kind of pass that smell test. That a reasonable person looking at it would say, yeah, they got to hear from a range of experts. Yes, they had sufficient independence. Yes, there was an invitation to government to sincerely contemplate what was proposed and incorporate that in a policy process. I don't think Citizens Assemblies should just be given carte blanche to decide on behalf of our elected representatives, but I think they can make a very powerful complementary and contributing role.
Thank you for that, Peter. And I think also obviously grounding the work with nonpartisan organizations who have, built that with that reputation of trust is pivotal as well. So speaking of which, I'd love to invite Lisa Semchuk, who's my former colleague and dear friend, to tell us a little bit about, the other piece to it as well, the commission and how it works, in parallel, and how Mass LBP and PPF ultimately weave together the two experiences. So Lisa, in just a couple, sentences or so, can you please tell us about how the commission itself works?
Absolutely.
And welcome, by the way. Great to see you.
Yes, thank you so much, Victoria. It's great to be here on behalf of PPF and our project secretariat, highlighting the incredible work that's being done both by the Commission and the Citizens Assembly. So let's start off a little bit about, the Commission and what that is. To briefly note, it comes from a long lineage of PPF work. extending, all the way back to 5 years ago when we first published The Shattered Mirror, to more recently, the Digital Democracy Project that was looking at kind of how do we prepare journalists to, spot and mitigate disinformation during the 2019 federal election, how do we monitor that media environment. And so the Demacts, as we like to refer to in shorthand, is a new 3-year initiative. PPF is definitely spearheading that, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of our key partners and collaborators, Mass LVP being one of them, and also the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy at McGill University. And that is all about looking at, how do we mitigate these harms that we're seeing that are happening online and that are kind of acting as a barrier to full democratic engagement and participation online. And at the center of that project is the commission itself. And that's meant to be a group of sort of distinguished Canadians. They maybe have, key experience or expertise or skills related to our kind of key topic that we're considering. As Peter mentioned previously, every year it's a different group. This year we're pleased to have as co-chairs Professor Taylor Owen and the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin. And they're joined by several other colleagues who might have experience in academic research, with journalism, with law, with human rights, or in kind of the political strategy environment. And I believe you'd also asked me about kind of how we go the process, how we bring those people together,
exactly. And thank you so much for this, because it really gives an eye to the design, which I think is helpful for our guests. So I'm really interested to know, how does the commission work with the Assembly?
Yes, so let's skip to that because it's a very exciting thing. So kind of similar to the Citizens Assembly process, we're thinking about how do we bring together a diverse and representative group of experts that's going to have that, healthy tension when we debate these issues, but in a much smaller group. The commission is typically 7 to 9 individuals. The Citizen Assembly is more a group of 42. Peter previously shared on his slides kind of those 2 overlapping circles. So we can kind of think of them as kind of 2 independent bodies that can, independently study and learn and deliberate on these issues. But there's key points where those 2 bodies interact, overlap, and intersect. And one such key touch point was this past fall. So coming off the heels of the Citizens Assembly kind of full learning and deliberation process, they presented their recommendations and discussed them with commissioners in Ottawa at the National Arts Centre. And so what was really, I think, fantastic about kind of creating that key moment of overlap is so, it wasn't just a presentation, the commission and the Assembly members got to sit down and have lunch together and really talk to each other about what they'd learned, what they'd experienced, what their ambitions are. But it also really was the moment where the commission themselves really started to deliberate, hone in, and focus on what they were going to be considering for their recommendations. So I think it really made for a key opportunity for those insights and recommendations coming from the Assembly to really underpin the Commission's own considerations of the policy options before them.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And I think this is really an extraordinary example of weaving together community and leadership of this kind. And unfortunately, I think it's actually quite rare in Canada. So I'm wondering, at the project kind of planning and conception, why was it important for your organizations to weave together community and leadership?
This really is a unique model. I think, why it's important is when we think about democracy, ultimately it's meant to serve and benefit people. And, threats that are very palpable to our democracy need democratic solutions to mitigate them. And is there a better way to do that than to serve the people than to bring Canada together in a room, as I know Peter so often loves to describe the Assembly, and really have them learn, think carefully, and deliberate on that issue. So I think there's immense value that comes from the recommendations of experts and key minds who've thought carefully about these issues. But those recommendations become even stronger and more bolstered when they're boosted by an informed public who's really carefully considered that same issue.
Great, thank you so much. So I'd love to invite Don and Olivier in just a moment, but before we do, I just want a sense of where the commission is in the process, please. So they're equipped with the recommendations of the Citizens Assembly. So what happens now, and where do the reports and the recommendations go?
Great question. So now the commission is still very much in the midst of their deliberations. We're looking to publishing a final report based on the recommendations that they decide at the end of March 2022. So keep your eyes peeled for that. As for where they go, so as Peter mentioned a little bit about some of our other external partnerships, this is an initiative that has been funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage, specifically through the Digital Citizenship Initiative and the McConnell Foundation. So ultimately, we plan to deliver those recommendations to our partners, but to the public as well. These are recommendations that any one of us can access and read. I can speak to last year, we briefed our partners about this initiative, and it led to briefing both McConnell Foundation and the Minister of Heritage's office. And we were pleased to see last year, as a result of those kind of key interactions, that many of the Commission's 6-point plan around what we do to mitigate online harms were reflected in proposed legislation from the previous government on how to mitigate against online harms.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it was a really exciting thing to see that, the hard work of the Citizens Assembly and the Commission was really carefully listened to. So not everything from the Commission and the Assembly made it in there. Some things that the Commission or the Assembly maybe disagreed on were there. So it wasn't a perfect overlap or a perfect agreement. And, there was a lot of.
Well, we see the efficacy for sure. So thank you, Lisa. That's extraordinarily helpful to just give a sense of, what happens next and where things go. Can we please invite Don and Olivier to join us? Hi, Olivier.
Hi, hello, thank you for having me.
Hi, Don, how are you?
Hello, fine, thank you. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. And we have Don and Olivier joining us from Whitehorse and from Lethbridge, and to really give their own individual perspectives on what serving on the Assembly was like, and to really kind of get a sense of what it was like to be in that room with Canadians from all over and from all walks of life. So Don, I had a quick question for you first. So I'm just wondering, in terms of, dynamics and vulnerability, how did all of you, start to build relationships and establish trust and, even like respectfully disagree with one another?
I think one of the brilliant things about the process is one of the first discussions you have is about values, and you saw them presented there. And you're sitting with a table full of strangers from totally different walks of life, and you quickly discover the things that matter to you matter to them. And it's a great deep icebreaker, if I can describe it as that. And I feel like once you realize how much you have in common, it becomes much easier to move forward. And I just thought that was brilliant, to have that opportunity to really see how much more we have in common than we have setting us apart.
That's really well said. Thanks so much. And for you, Olivier, before I should say, what did you like about online platforms before, and potentially what did you dislike? And how has your opinion evolved from being part of this assembly?
What I like, what I did like about online platform, it was always showing me the thing I wanted to see. So it was really a big realization with some members of the assembly to discuss about a hard subject, and to see that I was pulling on the side and some members were pulling on the other side, and it would happen really in a subtle way. My opinion and what evolved after the assembly, it's really to go to be mindful, to go see on the other side of the medal. The best example I was thinking recently with my father, it was the tension in Ukraine. It's always those Russian are putting a lot of military vehicle and on the frontier, but on the Russian side, it's the NATO that always pushing to the east. Anyway, there's always two sides of the medal, and this assembly really opened my eyes on to be more mindful, to go see on the other side voluntarily, because it's not really the social media that's gonna push something you kind of don't want to see. all in a way on how the algorithm is kind of built, I will say. Yeah.
I think that's incredibly powerful to really forefront that the idea that this is helping to reduce polarization and to really look at multiple perspectives. So thank you for that. One question I have for both of you is, now that you've taken part in, something around democracy over a multi-month period, how do we help to shift Canadians away from the notion that their experience with democracy is far more than, an infrequent trip to the ballot box? Like, how do you look at democracy now? Dawn, did you want to go first?
That's a tough one, because so many people I talk to really do think that is their full duty, is to vote. And I think part of what happens is people become disengaged when they go to the town hall, and it's very clearly two polarized sides yelling at each other, and you're not actually getting any discussion, and there's no listening going on, just a lot of talking. I'm hopeful that if people can take the time to see that there's a different way to build consensus and to have informed discussions without the yelling, that there is a way for them to engage, and there is a way for them to take part on an ongoing basis. I think that would be lovely.
That's really well said. Thank you, Dawn. And Olivier, what are your thoughts on that?
I really like the idea, like in Belgium, to have this permanent assembly of discussion. I think we need to make the political world more young, more attractive, more available to the general public. What I really liked with this assembly is the structure. The structure it will bring us knowledge at the beginning, and it will like lead us through process and structure to end up at something really fruitful, and at something really fruitful. And I think if you will make it like in a city hall or like in a community, I will personally never miss one assembly of those kind. And I think it will just it will attract a lot of citizens. I think it will be more engaging, and like my coworker said, Dawn, it will just attract a lot of people and make it more more available.
Yeah, and even as an option, I think people don't necessarily realize that there are ways to partake. So this is part of the work that public education has. So now I want to actually talk about like feelings and emotions a little bit. I think that this elicits, and thinking about harms, about democratic engagement, about all these issues that matter to so many of us, which is why we're all here. I read an interesting article on democracy, on what it actually feels like and the affect of it. And they actually described democracy as both exhilarating, uncertain, and marked with complexity. So I'm wondering, what emotions did this work and experience elicit in you, Dawn?
The experience of being together in Ottawa, number one, it was lovely to be with people after 2 years nearly of not. And with incredible people. I've missed these people. And I know that in my walk of life, I'm likely to never cross paths with them again, other than with this context. And I miss them. The assembly process is both exhilarating and exhausting. I came home from it just mentally spent, and yet at the same time, weirdly energized. So it's this magical recipe that just left such a great feeling. It just felt like we were part of something that would never be replicated again. It was just lovely.
Would you say that perhaps the sum total of that experience is fulfillment, or how would you kind of describe that feeling of both, feeling exhausted but inspired and with purpose? Or what are your thoughts?
It was absolutely satisfying to hear our final report on that Sunday emerge like some miracle, because it felt like we didn't have enough time. How is this ever going to come together? And it just felt so good to hear it. And I feel really proud of the work that went on.
Well, congratulations. It really is an extraordinary report, and one that I have thoroughly enjoyed reading. Olivier, I'd love to ask you the same question. How did you actually feel like through the process and towards the end, and maybe even now?
Oh, the biggest emotion for me was faith in discussion, and see how discussion is important to democracy, how it is the base, and also the freedom of speech. It was really it gave me my faith back into this process, really, to see the conservative more people alike and the more liberal people alike able to have some discussion and to work together to come up with. So we were all sitting at the table, six person, and now everyone's giving like some idea, and at the end of the hour, what emerged from this table is so smart, it's so well formulated, and it's impressive to see the power of the discussion, the power of the respect, and the non-judgmental attitude. And also right now it just gives me a sense of, I've bought a book of Preston Manning, which was one of the founder of the Conservative Party in Canada, and it's 365 ways to strengthen Canada through the democracy. And I'm just so excited to read it, but I got a bunch of books to read first.
Oh, that's so excellent. I'm so glad that you found some additional literature to continue, your quest that I think all of you have kind of embarked on. And so I'm actually interested to hear a little bit more about you as well. What experiences, whether it be like your day jobs, your lived experiences, or your relationships, what experiences did you bring to the conversation that you really drew on to help kind of ground yourself in the work, or help to make some recommendations? Or if not, I think that would be really interesting to hear about as well. Dawn?
My background is I had 20 years as a journalist. So I brought into this a passion for the freedom of expression, and this an unintended consequence should not be that we clamp down on people's right to be wrong. But I also come to it from my work in a post-secondary now in communications, and there was an entire table discussion about the research part of it and the understanding of ethics and the different requirement. I've done research. It was a simple survey, and I had to take an entire research ethics course and run it through an ethics board. And to understand that that is not the case for any of this technology, that it's basically, if you can build it, why not build it? So to know that that was on the table, and being at a table with a woman who'd spent her career as a developer, and with a fellow who's in post-secondary and a social sciences researcher, it was just this perfect mix of people talking about, we have to fix this. This is a glaring hole. So I hope I contributed something in that, but it was just magical to watch it unfold.
I think you absolutely did. So thank you for that. How about you, Olivier?
Oh, about me, I didn't have a lot of background into all the social and the ethic and all this stuff. I'm mostly a manual person working on construction site, but I really have an interest in psychology, into history too, the 20th century, how the Soviet Union came to be, and how it's important to have freedom of speech, how it's important to have fundamental right. And when I've received the letter, it was just like a wonderful opportunity to at an individual level, to try to contribute a little bit of my own opinion. But like I said, when you're sitting at the table, you think everything you think is like it's right and it sounds good, but finally only 10% of what I was thinking and bringing to the table was actually like stayed into the conversation. So I've contributed, but it's really a work of all the table and all the people that were there. Just everyone like contributed a little bit, and it formed such a professional and good report, word formulated.
Incredible. Thank you. And yeah, I think it's right to say that, the report is representative of a weaving together really of, how Peter characterized it earlier, Canada in a room. And I think that's, one of the reasons why it's so compelling. I have one more question for both of you, and then I'd love to kind of segue to some audience participation and some questions. So what do you think, and just, based on your own personal learnings and experiences, what are some potential pathways that you're excited about in terms of, how can we start to use the internet and social media more positively, or just, perhaps one of the recommendations that you're most excited about as well? Really kind of an open question in that regard.
Well, I'm very excited about the section on research, as I mentioned. In terms of a path forward, I think we have a long way to go to help the average user of these platforms understand how they're being manipulated with the kinds of information they see. And I think if we can make a dent in that, it will help. And that goes back to those recommendations about user control and public education. For my own part, my road forward, I definitely will be more mindful when I'm online. And I will take an extra minute before I pass something along. If we could all just be a bit more mindful that what we're seeing may not be true, I think that would go a long way to helping us.
I think that's quite insightful, because I think for many people, you could grow up kind of taking the news at face value or taking what you read at face value, whereas we're really operating in a different culture and a different kind of environment now. So, thank you for sharing that. Olivier, what are some pathways or some thoughts that you're excited to potentially take forward or see taken forward?
Well, definitely public education, and like Dawn said, to be mindful. People need to realize that they're being pushed in a side, like unconsciously most of the time. And public education, there were an idea that was suggested during those discussions about creating in school, in young school, a group of discussion to try to debate, like of course under supervision of neutral teacher, those kind of discussion to improve critical thinking, and also like to encourage to go see both sides of the medal. And the other recommendation, the other things that I was enthusiastic about, it's the international collaboration to regulate social those companies, like for example Facebook and Google and Twitter, because we need not to be naive. The reach of Canada is like a middle power, like Peter said. So I think an international coalition or an international group that might form in maybe a decade or 5 years will have really more power into imposing relegation or sanction onto social media. And that's what I was enthusiastic about.
Thanks so much. So now I really want to turn to the audience, and actually before we take your questions, and thank you for sending them in, we have a few great ones to begin with. I actually want to give you a sense of what it's like to be on a Citizens Assembly, and give an example of one of the questions that was actually deliberated. So let's pose it to the audience. Ashley is going to share a link with you. So the question is, what are the values that should guide Canada's approach to regulation for the purposes of reducing misinformation? So we have a Mentimeter question there for you, and you can actually write your comments in. And I'm just going to share a couple of the results out so that we can, we're doing our own Citizens Assembly for a moment, so to speak. So please go right ahead. And our panelists are welcome to engage in that as well. I know you've already done the work, but okay, so we're starting to see some things already. So one answer is that informed citizenry is essential to not only democracy, but societal well-being and public good over private interest. Okay, that's awesome. I'm just going to do another refresh and see if anything. Oh yeah, so equity has come up, protecting free speech balanced with social responsibility, and centering the people most affected. Okay, so thank you for your participation. I see some more things pouring in. So we'll actually, put together some of these things. And we're actually going to extend the session to 1:15 today. So if people can stay on for a little bit longer to do some Q&A, then we can just have a few more minutes there. So now I'd love to start to pose some of the questions from the audience. So from our guest, Miranda, The name Citizen Assembly implies that only Canadian citizens are invited to participate. Are people who don't have citizen status also eligible to be included in the outreach? Peter, did you want to take that one?
Absolutely. And the answer is yes. You know, we're not checking anyone's formal citizenship status. If you are a resident of Canada, you're very welcome to participate. The concern around the word citizen is one of the reasons why often when we're running local municipal processes, we call them residence reference panels. It's absolutely more inclusive. But there is something about the call to citizenship that is important. So while it's not a formal requirement, we are trying to invoke the kind of role and responsibility of the members in the assembly to be thinking on behalf of all residents, all citizens of Canada.
Thanks so much. And Lisa, I think this one I'll direct to you. So this is coming from Fazia. Is Web 3.0 considered a threat to our democratic values by the Commission? If so, was it deliberated at the 2021 Assembly or at the Commission, or will it be considered in future deliberations?
I think generally where we're coming from in a place of trying to make recommendations is making sure that they not only speak to the now, but are also quite, future proof. I think we've seen so much, even just in the past 5 years, how rapidly these environments change and how quickly the ground can shift underneath one's feet. So I think for, what I've seen from the Citizens Assembly and definitely what I've seen from the Commission's deliberations is there's a definite concern that whatever is put forward has to be, applicable to whatever form the web will take next, which is very hard for us to predict, but we will, do what we can to make sure those recommendations are taking into account future developments.
Okay, that's great. And so thank you for that. I think it'd be fun to do the next two questions as kind of a rapid fire round and have you all kind of provide a quick, snappy response if that's okay with you. So I'm wondering, is there a particular policy, I should say, I'm not wondering, one of our guests posted, but I'm also curious, is there a particular policy issue or challenge confronting Canada that you think would be right for this approach? So, perhaps Olivier, we'll start with you. When you were in the Citizens Assembly and you saw how the process was unfolding, did you think, okay, there's this issue that I think would really benefit from having this process applied to it?
Definitely the polarization of our society. Yeah, I think it was one of the biggest issue. I think to create more structured discussion into communities and into villages and into city, so people can engage in a I hate the word safe space, but in a respectful space with non-judgmental, like the Commission. I think it will really help about the polarization of the society, because I think if you got the polarization, you see the other person as an enemy, so you don't you always like on the defensive right away, and the discussion is so important. It's the foundation of our society.
Don?
I think I would look more for a local issue, and in my community, I would love to see us have these conversations about homelessness, addictions, care. There's a lot happening in our community about that, and it's become so divisive that I don't see a path forward without some serious discussion.
Yeah, I think that's well said, because, this model assembled Canada in a room, but there's nothing to stop from a community in a room, a town in a room, or really have that representative kind of democracy and deliberation, have different lenses and scope. Lisa?
So when I think about, some of the existential threats facing our society that keep me awake at night, one is disinformation, because I think that kind of, polarization prevents us from having meaningful conversations in this sort of environment. When I think about a policy area that I think would really benefit from this is something in perhaps climate change. I think we see that as a big threat that dominates a lot of public discourse, that is heavily polarized, but is at the top of Canadians' minds, not only just when they go to the polls, but in their day-to-day lives. And I think, a process like a Citizens Assembly where we can bring folks together who will become informed citizens and kind of cut through some of that talking at each other. I see Olivier is holding up one of his fantastic books. So that definitely comes to mind as, I think, an area of policy that would really benefit from having some of this insight.
Amazing. And Peter?
I would echo. I've looked to a number of jurisdictions. I think there have been 10 in Europe that have had climate assemblies and that have had real impact on how countries are managing what ought to be a just transition. There's still a lot of question marks hanging over how Canada intends to meet its goals in 2030 and beyond. But then I think about the use of these processes and how we actually build them into Canada's democratic culture, because I think you could hear from Olivier and Dawn just that there's an intrinsic value in this kind of conversation. And that's why the majority of mass processes have been local or have been provincial. Because while they're these exciting, big, important topics, it's the workaday business of government, which I think is as important for citizens to tackle. And we've put forward a proposal called Game Changer about how we would get to running 80 of these processes a year in Canada, and how in the space of a decade, a sizable portion of the country would find those brown envelopes through its door and have the opportunity to become a part of it. If we want to address polarization, if we want to address the democratic malaise, then we need to invest, and we need to scale up processes like these so that more Canadians have an opportunity to take that seat.
Thank you for that. So now we have a question from Nicholas that's come in, and I'm going to actually fuse it with a question I have as well. So Nicholas's question is, are there any ideas for online variations of this kind of engagement and to add accessible options or avoid expenses or risk of real life engagement with COVID, which I think actually happened during the Citizens Assembly? And to kind of marry with that question, how can communities, across the nation really take up this process and create opportunities for citizens' voices to be heard and really offer them seats at the table? So I think the question is, how do we make this broader? And then how do we also be prepared to pivot to do it in a way that's cost effective, accessible, et cetera?
I think there are probably two questions there. One is about how do you expand the circle? How do you get more people an opportunity to involve themselves in deliberations? And that's where I think so many of the participatory mechanisms are really valuable, whether they're online or off. What an assembly does is act as a bit of a funnel, a kind of consolidator, which can take all of those different inputs, digest them, and then reach that consensus view. Look, in our first year, we ended up being forced into running the entirety of the proceedings online. I think we were all pleasantly surprised at the fortitude of the members. Fawzia is amongst them. I see others, and who stuck with it. But the reality is we had to take what would have been like a 7 or 8 day process, and with 6 time zones and 2 official languages, it became a 36 meeting, 18 session beast. It is doable. But like so many things that are doable, I'm not sure I would rush to do it again.
Thank you. And thank you for, giving us an insight that planning these things, like nothing is ever perfect, that pivots have to occur, that you have to build with all these kinds of lenses and equity considerations in mind, because I know there's a lot of people here on the call who do stakeholder work, who build from, all these equity lenses. And so I think really pulling back the process of how that's done is a key learning for all of us today. So now we have another question coming in from Rael. There's a lot of talk about a citizens' assembly on electoral reform in Ontario under the next government post-election. What would it take to get different parties on board to potentially make this happen? Peter, I think that's a question for you primarily, but I think, if anybody else has ideas, we'll certainly weave in your thoughts and experiences too.
Oh, I think there are probably a lot of people in this session who would have ideas on the Liberal Party's promise. I mean, look, what they've said is that they're committed to ranked ballot, and that the purpose of the Citizens Assembly would be to strengthen other democratic mechanisms more broadly. And you can have your own opinion about that. I think one of the lessons that maybe Canada could draw, if it was to really pull back from its experience of citizen deliberation, is that if you want to convince a generation of elected officials of the merits of a process like this, it may be ill-advised for the very first high-profile initiative to target their jobs. And I think it left a lot of disquiet amongst a generation of elected officials. And I don't think, like, I mean, people are human.
Yes.
It's interesting that in other jurisdictions, they have tried to address problems that other politicians are trying to solve, and consequently, it has been seen it's been seen as less oppositional, and I think has just created a better appreciation for the merits of these processes, rather than immediately setting up a contest between elected officials and selected representatives. So if I just pulled back and didn't think about the importance of electoral reform, which I certainly believe in, and was just focused on how we embed these deliberative processes, I'd say we should earn our spurs elsewhere, and then hopefully in the future can bring these processes to bear on democratic reforms.
Thank you, Peter. That's super helpful. And now I'd like to actually welcome John Beebe to join us, who's actually going to talk about a few things that are coming up for the exchange. But just before I do, I just wanted to wish a sincere and genuine thank you to our guests today. I think this has been immeasurably helpful in terms of learning, in terms of resource sharing, in terms of community building, and really what organizations can come together to do. So over to you, John.
Yes, thank you very much. And likewise, I'd like to thank everyone here for joining us today, and Victoria for leading the conversation, and Ashley for making the technology, as always, run smoothly without flaw. And I think, what really struck me in this conversation is this need to develop processes for us to come together as community members to make decisions, make recommendations, and reduce partisanship and reduce this polarization that we are seeing, and hearing powerfully from everyone here how this process can do that piece. Really, I think makes me think about in our work, how can we bring some of this together? And what Dawn suggested about starting with values, and I know that Peter and the team has really put a lot of thought into how we begin this process, and where we start with a value conversation and come together there as a starting point, is such a critical insight, and looking for other opportunities to take that insight into our deliberative processes. And they don't even need to always be deliberative processes that lead to even a direct input, but they can just be those conversations. Because so much of what we see on the social media, we know are not anything like a deliberative process, and they certainly do not directly inform our policy decisions. But nonetheless, they are highly polarizing. And so I appreciate that piece. I appreciate everyone who took the time to join us today. I'd invite you, if you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter. Check out engagedemocracy.ca. To get the latest of what we're up to. And please join us. We have a provincial election happening here in Ontario in a few months. We're going to be doing a lot of work to engage, but we're going to be doing that work based on these same principles of how do we engage around our values, and use those values to come together as a community and use the election for that conversation. So thank everyone again. We will see you. This is a conversation that has started, and congratulations to the team at PPF, at Mass, and all the Citizen Assembly members for an incredible amount of work and commitment. You all deserve huge kudos for the work, and I hope that this work continues to get out there and well known by Canadians across, who will understand the value of this work. So thank you. Have a wonderful day, and I appreciate all the efforts here.